Hey everyone, Matt Thomas here. Thanks for watching. So I want to talk about instructional pacing in a classroom, which for me is one of the most important aspects of teaching. And it's supported by behavioral psychology. And before I get into like what that looks like, let me set it all up. So as many of you know, before I became a high school teacher, I owned a martial arts school, self-defense school, karate dojo, whatever you want to call it. And for those who did it, full time, right? For those who are in that business, we all know kind of the formula. You teach kids to pay your rent. You teach adults for fun. So essentially, the most of our students, our clients, we're kids, right? That's what's going to keep your school open. That's what's going to keep your business open. And then you get to teach adults for fun. And so if a person doesn't teach kids well, if they don't kind of understand child psychology and all that stuff, they're not going to do well. They're not going to stay open. And one of the key secrets to teaching kids is behavioral psychology. It essentially is switching every 10 minutes, right? So constantly changing something, even when it all fits together, if it's the same the same theme of a class, you switch what you're doing every 10 minutes or so. And I always called it the learning arc. Now, that's not what it's called. If you Google learning arc, it's something different. But to me, it just made sense. So I have a picture here. So the learning arc would be like this. You want to teach kids in a way that so it's fun. When they're learning, they're fun. They're having a blast. But then there gets to a point where they're like, okay, I'm done. Right? Where either boredom sets in or they start to get stagnant or they're done doing what they're doing. Right? Sometimes it just doesn't take that long. And so the key is switching right when they're starting to feel like, all right, I think I'm done. So if you wait too long, you lose their motivation, they get tired, they get bored, they're thinking of other things, and then you've lost them, right? If you switch too quickly, like if they're really loving what they're doing, and then all of a sudden you switch, they're disappointed. And they're like, wait, what? So there's pushback. So the key is kind of, pacing to where they're doing something, they're enjoying it. Pretty soon they're like, okay, I think we're done. What? We're switching to something else? All right. So you're always keeping that motivation, that excitement up. And one of the mistakes sometimes, I like to share this story. When I was student teaching, my master teacher was notorious at doing pacing very poorly. So he would do quick writes. He would do a quick write that normally would take 5 minutes at the most. He would, I'm not exaggerating, give 20 to 25 minutes to do a 5-minute quick write. And I remember he would ask the students a question, and then he would come back to the back of the room while they're writing, and he'd talk to me for 20 minutes. And after 5 minutes, the students would start talking. They would get loud. They would get, rowdy. And then he'd be complaining to me, these guys should be writing, blah, blah, blah. And then he'd go up and yell at him. And I'm like, dude, you spent 20 minutes doing a 5-minute quick write. And so that was a terrible job at pacing. And with pacing, proper pacing, classroom management becomes a lot easier. And so essentially what I did when I became a teacher, I kind of brought that whole idea of pacing into the classroom. And this is kind of my mindset is essentially when starting class, I have starters, right? So when you start class, proper pacing, start with starters. And starters tend to take 3 to 5 minutes. And you can double up on them. I'll give you some examples of when I do that. So a starter might be a quick review of a previous lesson, like if you're continuing on with a unit. It might be a quick write. It could be journaling or asking, prior knowledge, right? Scaffolding. You could be telling stories. And usually if I'm doing storytelling, I'll then follow it up with a quick write. So I'm doubling up on the starters, right? So I'm telling a story and then I'm doing a quick write. Now, please, when you're telling a story, you do want to make sure the story is relevant for teens. I remember I was at a workshop maybe 10 years ago. Actually, quite a few, or some of you might have been there with me. We did this workshop where this guy gets up, and I honestly forgot what the workshop was about, but he starts telling a story. He's like, yeah, I told my students the other day the story about how I was playing hide and seek with my daughter and I couldn't find her. And I couldn't find her for like 20 minutes. And the story went on for like 10 minutes. He just kept telling about how he couldn't find her. And in my mind, and honestly, there was no payoff to the story. He just kind of stopped it when he said he found his daughter. And I'm like, how is this relevant for teenagers? Right? So if you're telling a story, make sure it's relevant for what you're teaching and relevant to teenagers, right? They need to have a payoff. They need to see some excitement, maybe a little funny incident at the end, unless it's a more serious topic. A starter could be starting class with a short video, right? The students come in, the lights are out, the screen's on, they're like, ooh, right? You're developing or having that dopamine starting, right? Getting them excited. Short video, 3 to 5 minutes or so to set up what you're doing. It could be word searches, right? Using that spatial intelligence, especially when you're teaching new vocabulary. Have the students find words with that new vocabulary in there. Could be watching a cool math video to get students excited. Again, I mentioned this before, and I can't seem to find the videos, but out there's some like geometry videos using ninjas, right? They're school appropriate, and they're like really cool action scenes where ninjas have to calculate the sunset of the angle of blah blah whatever, right? But there's some cool math videos out there, and if I can find them, I'll definitely send them to you guys. It could be reviewing parts of a group project rather than just saying, okay, guys, get going with your project. Could be reviewing parts of it. Could be vocab review, grammar, proofreading, anything like that. But something that sets the class up. 3 to 5 minutes. You can double up on a couple of these, but don't do too many of them, right? Because then we come to our middlers. So you started the class with their intro stuff. They're looking forward to it. They're like, okay, great. Then you go right into maybe 10 or 12 minutes of basically leading them to the main part of your lesson. And so middlers could be having them take notes. Could be you lecturing because you're lecturing to set up the main part of your class. Could be a think, pair, share. It could be reading articles, not necessarily long stories, but like short articles if you're setting it up for a bigger purpose as the class goes on. Could be teaching new vocabulary, math instruction, right? So you did a review of yesterday's assignments. Now you're going on to the new instruction. It could be introducing a new part of the group project or modeling what it looks like. It could be filling out a graphic organizer if you're going to use that organizer for later on in the class. So middlers, like the middle of the lesson, and then you go into your main part, right? The main part of the lesson, the part where if their parents ask the students like, hey, what'd you do at school today? Oh, we wrote a story, or oh, we did this, whatever that main part is. And that main part could be lecture, right? Depending if it's a large lecture or not. It could be notes. You could be setting up what you're having them take notes on, right? Just depending on how, what you're doing for that day. It could be reading a story. So you did a quick write about a personal incident. You wrote notes about character development or something, and now you're reading the story. That's the main purpose of the class. It could be creating whatever you went over in class, right? It could be maybe you did the math review or the math instruction, and now you're having them do their math problems, right, for 20 minutes or so. That's the main part. It could be group work if you're doing a group project, right? Students don't necessarily need or want 55 minutes worth of group projects. That's just a long time, right? Naturally, after about 35 minutes or so of doing a big project, they might start to teeter off or think of other things. So maybe setting up things first before going into that main part. And it could be applying what was filled out with the graphic organizer. So the main part of a lesson is, 20, 25 minutes long. And then finally there's finishers. So usually 5 to 10 minutes. So a finisher could be a ticket out the door, whatever, that looks like to you. Could be assessment checks or quizzes. Could be gallery walk or four corners. Could be answering questions about the story. Let's say the main part was you read the story, and then the finisher is you ask the students questions about it. For math teachers, it might be beginning that math homework, right? So you set up by reviewing last week's lesson. Your middler was taking notes on the new stuff. The main part was them, doing the instruction that you want to do with them, right? And maybe you do a little review, and then you finish it by letting them start their homework. It could be planning time if the students are beginning a new group project. So let's say you're setting up this whole project, and there's 10 minutes left in class. All right, guys, let's go ahead and plan it before we really get into it tomorrow. Or if they're doing writing, maybe finish up by asking a couple of them to read their stories before class ends. Now, sometimes you don't have time for finishers. Like I do that too. I'll show you what my class might look like. So putting it all together. So pacing, essentially you're doing 3 to 4 things a day so that instruction gets separated a little bit, even though it's all geared around a certain theme or the same thing. It's not necessarily that you're jumping to 4 different, totally different subjects. You're not. You're making it around a certain theme or lesson. You're just doing 3 or 4 different things. So this is what it may look like. So you start with a starter, choose 1 or 2 starters, jump into a middler or a middle part, right? Go to your main part of your lesson, like what's your main purpose of the day, and then end with a finisher. Maybe have the students respond or some reflection, right? Writing, whatever it is, and then that's your class time. And the thing is, you don't necessarily, with pacing, you don't want to spend the whole time on one of these parts, right? Like you don't want to do a middle part of the assignment or lesson. You don't want to do that for the entire period. It shouldn't take that long, and your students will probably start to zone out or think of other things, right? If something's only meant to take 10 minutes, just take 10 minutes to do it. Now, of course, you can play with that time, right? So you don't, going back to the learning arc, right? You as a teacher, you definitely want to feel like, okay, we've been doing this thing for about 10 minutes, but my students are focused on it. I'm not going to jump ahead. Or I plan this to take, 5 minutes, but honestly, after 1 or 2, they're done. All right, we need to move on. So you as a teacher will be able to kind of figure that part out there. The key is to just not take too long for something that should only take a few minutes. And then, of course, not cutting it way too short. So this is how it looks like with one of my classes last week. So we did it on a Monday, so it was a shorter period. But the lesson I did was we were talking about analysis of marketing and advertising and persuasion. And so we looked at the terms ethos, pathos, logos. We did appealing to logic, appealing to emotion, credibility, audience, and essentially AP Lang stuff, right? I'm setting my students up for what they're going to need in 11th grade and looking at for speeches and all that stuff. So that was the purpose of what we did. And so my starter was, essentially, I'm setting them up with how persuasion works. And we did a quick review of what I asked them to do yesterday. So that's how we started, which was a problem solution writing. I gave them some notes. So that review of yesterday took about 3 minutes. I gave them notes on, ethos, pathos, logos, definitions, examples, etc. That took about 7 minutes. While they were writing, I told them a story and I asked them, hey, do you know which parent to go to when you want something? Which parent's the emotional one, the logical one? And I made that personal connection. And while they're writing notes, we joked a little bit about that while they're writing the notes. So my starters total took about 10 minutes. My middler was then we analyzed print ads. So I showed 3 examples of advertisements and we analyzed it. We looked at emotion, we looked at logic, we looked at credibility, we looked at who the audience was. I did it with them, I did it first to model it. We did it together as a class, then I had them do it completely on their own. And that took 10 minutes. So that was a perfect time for a middler. The main part then was they found an ad by themselves. They Google imaged an ad and then they analyzed it all themselves on a Google Doc and then turned that in. That was the main part. I didn't have time for a finisher because it was the shorter Monday period. If it was a longer regular day, then maybe I'd have someone come up and display their ad and then show how they analyzed it. So I might do that. Anyway, that's how pacing works. For me, it's great, and it is supported by behavioral psychology. So that's all I got. Thanks, guys.